It's day 253. It's also January 14th, 2020, and we're in Navarre, Florida. You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. Well, we might not have been as road ready as I'd thought. Whatever that bug was that I'd picked up back in Louisiana, well, turns out it stuck around a bit. We made it around 123 miles from Vidalia and called it a day in a place called Columbia, Mississippi. I felt like I was having a bit of a relapse. Or maybe it's just all the driving we'd done in the past few days. 500 or so miles might not sound like a lot, but it was quite an accomplishment for this trio. In the 8 months or so we've been at this, we've barely made it 100 miles at a time before finding another spot to hang out in and learn about. I went to bed pretty early in Columbia, feeling pretty cruddy, and got up late the next morning feeling about the same. But we drove some more anyways. That storm that had chased us out of Galveston might have passed, but now there's talk of more bad weather in the area. So we just kept going. And I guess I really wasn't paying attention as I put Mississippi in the rear view, and then Alabama. Because it sort of caught me by surprise when I passed a sign that read, "Welcome to Florida." We'd covered just over 200 miles when we found Navarre. And it seemed like a pretty awesome place to look for a spot to park. And man, did we find one. An awesome little park managed by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. As we pulled into the 12-site park facing Pensacola Bay, I was finding it hard to believe that this was a free boondocking site. We've boondocked now in some 12 states, and I've yet to see one as well-groomed and monitored as this one. The very nice FWC folks are on site several times a day checking in on folks. You can even go on their website and reserve spots. And I'm guessing that this is a pretty popular spot during the spring and summer months. It was about half full for us. Nicely done, Florida. Now let's see if we can put up with mosquitoes. Yup, mosquitoes in January. We spent a couple of nights here in our cool little spot on Florida's northwest panhandle. And I had no idea, until after we'd left, that the movie Jaws 2 was filmed in large part just up the beach a ways from where we had stayed. Seems the site was chosen due to the mild climate provided during filming, and the ability to replicate, with a few props, the look of the Martha's Vineyard coastal area where the film's plot was to have taken place. And these white sandy beaches, like the one Dougie and I walked on several times during our stay, turns out Navarre is famous for these beaches. Nearly pure crystal quartz, some of the cleanest and purest beaches in the world. The result of millions of years of rivers like the Chattahoochee and the Apalachicola, washing sediments from the Appalachia mountain range further inland down through this area and evacuating into the Gulf of Mexico, followed by millions of years of those wave actions constantly washing over the sands, further purifying those sugary white beaches. And Navarre is also home to the longest fishing pier in the state of Florida, a 1,545-foot-long pier extending into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's famous for the fishing opportunity it provides. The Gulf Island National Seashore, also calls Navarre home, a national park that attracts over 5 million visitors each year. Learning of everything Navarre is today, it's hard to believe that as recently as the 1970s, fewer than 2,000 folks called Navarre home. And just as we had discovered in Louisiana, the list of names of Native American tribes that have inhabited the area for centuries continues to grow. Here in Navarre, for the first time, I'd read of the Apalachee, the Apalachicola, the Timucua, and the Pensacola people. In this part of the country, these folks, like so many across the continent, would find themselves crossing paths with the Spanish explorers as early as the 1500s. And it would be over 150 years or so before American settlers would show up in the area. The area was originally known as Egan, before it was renamed Navarre, named after the Navarre province in Spain. And during the Civil War, Confederate troops built Fort McCree on Navarre Beach to defend the Pensacola Bay. And while Union troops would make several attempts to capture the bay, they would never be successful, and remnants of the fort can still be seen on the beach today. And the timber industry in the mid-1800s would be the next big thing for Navarre, as it became the hub for the industry. The establishment of Baghdad Village as a lumber town played a significant role in the local economy. The town flourished thanks to logging and manufacturing, and many historic buildings from that area still stand. And this would be the second place in the country we'd learned of an area being named Baghdad. That first one, the copper mining town way back there in Arizona. And a bridge would be constructed in the 1920s connecting the area with nearby cities, essentially beginning the era of tourism for Navarre. The world was on to the natural beauty here. And the introduction of the Eglin Air Force Base during World War II would bring yet another era of development and growth to Navarre. Eglin would grow to become one of the largest military facilities in the country, covering over 640 square miles. And by some measures, the largest Air Force base in the world, with the presence of over 20,000 military personnel patrolling over 130,000 square miles of airspace, which includes over 120,000 square miles of over-water airspace in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. It feels like the 40,000 or so folks that call Navarre home today, they got it pretty good. A beautiful place, full of outdoor activity opportunity, beautiful beaches, and school systems that rank amongst the highest in the state. But then, there was that one more click. I spent our last night in Navarre doing a bit of reading about one of the states we had just driven through, barely even stopping in, Mississippi. Back in Louisiana, as I had just learned about that state's incredible wealth and how so little of that wealth makes it to the residents of the state, and in fact, in nearly all measures that matter, from education levels to life expectancy, annual income, poverty rates, the state ranks amongst the worst in the nation. And on most of those lists, Mississippi ranks dead last, the poorest in the nation. And again, I was curious, why? I mean, I get it, there has to be a richest and a poorest state on any list, right? But the disparities here are striking. At the top of the list, California, which literally owns the fifth largest economy in the world, meaning an economy larger than most countries in the world. And places like Texas, New York, and Illinois, they find their way to the top of that list as well. And there are 1,000 different ways to parse the numbers here, and I'm no economist, nor do I want to be. But if you read through and ask the internet enough questions, some interesting patterns begin to surface, just as I'd learned in Louisiana. And there were a couple of things that made Mississippi even more of a fascinating case study in economics for me. First of all, just as with Louisiana, Mississippi poverty rates are not necessarily directly tied to the state's economy. Mississippi's economy is actually 37th in the nation at nearly $140 billion a year, which means there are 13 states in the country that generate less in revenues each year. Places like Montana, South Dakota, Vermont, Wyoming, even Alaska, all have smaller economies than Mississippi. But when you rank the states by those poverty levels and mortality rates, you won't find any of those 5 states at the bottom of the list. And yet, you will always find Mississippi there. Another thing that set Mississippi apart for me was to learn that the state actually started out as one of, and by some indicators, the richest state in the Union. And it's really been in just the last couple hundred years or so that the state has plummeted from the top to the bottom of that list. And the folks that live there, they were just along for the ride. And again I wondered, what happened and is happening here? And it turns out, the first thing that happened, well, that should have been fairly obvious to me. The Civil War and the abolition of slavery. Mississippi had established itself early on as a key player in the cotton industry in the nation. With demand within the country, as well as globally growing exponentially, Mississippi's economy would grow rapidly, and in a time when those cotton farmers didn't have to pay their labor force. And if you take labor out of any economic calculation, well, things look pretty different. So I guess, maybe, in a lot of ways, things were similar to today. At least in that the money that is generated in the state, very little of it goes into the pockets of those that produce the products and services that generate the revenue. But some other things began to take place as well in Mississippi. As the rest of the country began to invest in things like infrastructure and technologies that would produce more efficiencies among the workforce, Mississippi appears to have planted itself firmly in the past. With the state graced by a massive waterway system on which to move product cheaply, and a cheap labor force even after the abolishment of slavery, the policymakers and the plantation owners of the time, they saw no need to take money out of their pockets to invest in the future, especially because they perceived no personal benefit in any of these investments. And this, it seems, in my takeaway anyway, is where some seriously and nearly literally fatal decisions would be made by those policymakers of the time. Most all of the rest of the country had marched straight into that industrial age. And at the time, Mississippi was actually positioned extremely well and could have moved into the industrial era as the economic powerhouse it was and secure the future in a very different way. The state's strategic location, waterway system, fertile soils, and access to the ocean could have all been leveraged to move the state in a very different direction. But key decisions continued to take place within the state's legislature and would continue to chip away at any solid economic future the state might have had. For example, education. Well after the Civil War, and even up through the turn of the century, the state failed to invest in education. The rural nature of the state meant that any children that were offered an education were homeschooled for the most part, and it was perceived that there was no benefit in investing in folks that would end up doing menial labor on those cotton plantations. And it's also evident that there was an underlying reason for the state's resistance to move into the industrial era. The majority of the workforce at the time was made up of freed slaves, and business owners of the time had no interest in needing to rely on a paid black workforce. or even allowing them to work in their businesses at all, including potential factories. And another interesting factoid I'd picked up is that the state's massive decline in wealth also had to do a bit with accounting systems of the time. Up through the Civil War, on paper, in Mississippi, slaves were counted as an asset, a piece of property given a set value. Upon losing that asset after the Civil War, the wealth of the state began to look much different, very quickly. And Mother Nature hasn't exactly been on the state's side either. Constant flooding and destructive storm systems make doing business in the state, even today, a proposition that comes with a unique set of risks. In more modern times, Mississippi has had to invest billions into flood protection across the Mississippi Delta, which is an investment that, quite frankly, most other states simply have not had to make. But that said, there are other states in the region that have dealt with and continue to deal with similar challenges and have managed to grow into major economies without many of the issues that plague Mississippi. Florida, Tennessee, for example. And again, what keeps getting in Mississippi's way? Well, one perspective is that Mississippi didn't fall from the top of the list so much as it just got passed up by most everyone else, in large part due to those decisions around investment in education early on. And by the time they did come around to the notion of industrialization, mechanization, and investing in infrastructure, the vast majority of the country had such a head start that it really became a matter of catch-up, and compounded by the fact that the state, to this day, lacks a serious talent pool to work from. A significant portion of the state's population remain undereducated and poverty-stricken, while more than a couple of generations now of Mississippians that have gone off to college haven't returned home, but instead choosing to secure higher income positions in states with more opportunity. But in reading of all this, I'd also read that in recent years, the state has begun to see an uptick in folks moving to Mississippi. Many of the factors that have been challenges for the state have resulted in a place where everything from housing to the cost of services and goods all lead to one of the lowest cost of livings in the United States. And this fact has begun to attract folks to the region, a trend that hopefully Mississippi is positioned to capitalize on in a new era. So complex. And just one more place back on our list to visit. For real next time. Pulling out of our campsite this morning, I was struck by that red dirt road taking us back out to civilization. And I'm not sure why it hadn't registered as we arrived. Maybe I was just tired. But I could suddenly hear Brooks and Dunn singing of that red dirt road, and was suddenly reminded of something I'd seen earlier. A Welcome to Mississippi sign stating the birthplace of America's music. And I'd never heard that expression applied to Mississippi before. But after reading it, I realized that I had started registering things a little differently as I read and saw them. Even thinking back through Texas. And there I was, hearing Reba singing of Oklahoma, Whoever's in New England, and Heartbreak in Tennessee. Leanne Womack singing about Little Rock. Tracy Lawrence pining away on Paint Me a Birmingham. Charlie Pride asking, is anyone going to San Antone? Marty Robbins singing of that West Texas town of El Paso. Glenn Campbell telling the story of a young soldier longing to return to his beloved in Galveston. And yeah, Brooks and Dunn telling of their childhood lessons on that red dirt road. It was as if I was not excited enough to explore this brand new old world. I could suddenly picture Elvis Presley and Faith Hill growing up in Mississippi, Reba, Garth, Blake in Oklahoma, and the army of industry-influencing artists that Texas has tossed out into the world for all of us to listen to. In some ways, we had passed and were passing through hallowed grounds, and just another element to explore and learn of as we continue this adventure. But with the potential of some more tricky weather in the forecast, it was time to continue east. As usual, no idea where we'll call it a night, but I wonder what we'll learn there.
Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously, you can.